Hi, this is Jurgen Rasmussen. I got some book recommendations for you. I want to recommend some books to you that have really impacted my life and made a difference. And also books that I know have made a big difference for some colleagues and clients as well. Now, these are books that have impacted me in a particular way around the topic of helping me to gain deeper appreciations into the map not being the territory. Someone once said that there's one idea that's literally true in the field of neurolinguistic programming, and that is that old Alfred Korzybski quote, the map is not the territory. Very often when people make changes in coaching or hypnotherapy or psychotherapy or through reading, there's some refinement in map territory distinctions. There's more of an appreciation that the map is in fact not the territory. I remember, by the way, when I first started studying NLP back in 1997, and I attended my very first NLP course here in Norway with a guy called Mike Shikanovich, who is now passed a few years ago. But I remember that he was talking about the map not being the territory, before lunch on the first day. And when I came back from lunch, he was still talking about the map not being the territory. And I remember thinking, like, Jesus, man, I got it. How complex can it be? We're got to be done with that stuff. It's past lunch already, right? But now, more than 25 years later, almost 30 years later, this is my favorite topic. And I'm still gaining deeper insights into the map not being the territory, seeing it in more contexts more of the time. So, oh, by the way, when I recommend books here, I do not mean to imply that the only way you can have deeper map territory distinctions is through reading books. That's not my message, that's not my implication. You can certainly deepen these distinctions through experiences and explorations in the world and through psychedelics and meditation and so on and so forth. It's just that this particular video is about books, and it's often very useful to study different angles and different frameworks. So, since I mentioned NLP, there is a great book by my former mentor, John Grinder, and his wife, Carmen Bostic St. Clair. Although I don't know how much Carmen has contributed to the book, but be that as it may, um, that book is a great book when it comes to epistemology, how we know what we know. There's a lot of great examples around the territory not even being the territory, meaning that there's a lot of stuff going on that's happening at speeds and frequencies which our sensory systems are not able to detect. So a lot of the territory we don't really even have access to, and it also explains how um, by the time something reaches conscious awareness, so to speak, our linguistic filters, our internal processes, has already massaged and tweaked the information. Not only that, but how our beliefs and our expectations to a large degree influence what even is possible to arise as a sensory experience to begin with. You may have heard about the invisible gorilla example. There's a book by that title, maybe 15 years ago or so. I think it was around 2012, where some researchers had people watch a basketball match and they were assigned to notice how many times the basketball was passed between players on the same team during some sort of sequence. And then a gorilla, or obviously a human being dressed up as a gorilla, appeared in the movie. But later, when people were asked if they noticed anything in particular, only about 50% of the people had even noticed the gorilla. So our beliefs, our expectations, our map, so to speak, can significantly influence what we are able to detect with our senses to begin with. So if you read Whispering in the Wind, you'll get an appreciation also of how when meditators, for example, talk about direct experience, it's not really direct experience, right? But it's closer to direct experience. So I highly recommend that one. Another great book that I would recommend to you guys is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Kahneman, by the way, got the Nobel Prize in Economics back in 2002 as a psychologist. I really like this book. It's a great book. It goes into heuristics, these typical heuristics that the human mind, that the Homo sapiens operating system seems to have. And it gives a lot of practical examples of how these heuristics play out in real life. And it gave me a deeper appreciation of the role of thinking in our experience, and how we kind of construct our experience through these various mental shortcuts. He also has this a great way of showing through examples what he calls what you see is all there is. This tendency that we human beings have in confusing what he calls internal coherence, the feelings of certainty on the inside, the feeling of knowing, the feeling of having something figured out, how we tend to conflate that with competency or a full understanding of something in the world. So this book has deeply influenced how I frame my sessions with clients, and it's helped me, at least I hope, to be at least a little bit better at not so easily conflating internal coherence with a full competency of something in the world. To be more skeptical of the feelings of being certain. Another a great psychology book that I really love and really like is called Strangers to Ourselves by the social psychologist Timothy Wilson. It really does a great job in showing how our introspective abilities are very limited, and how we actually don't have access to our own mental processes, as weird as that sounds. I'll give an example. So let's say that you walk outside, you see the sun, you see the clear blue sky, now you have no access to, so we can call this the act of perception, right? You have no access to the processes that the colors and shapes emerge out of. So we don't really have access to the processes that our decisions and choices emerge out of either. But we think we do. The left hemisphere, the interpreter of the mind, is always creating stories about why we did what we did and what motivated us, and what this book does a great job of through writing about various social psychology experiments is just showing how this left hemisphere interpreter can be tricked and duped, and how it will readily make up stories even when it has no access to what's going on. So, after reading that book, you may very well arrive at a kind of stance of the most intellectually honest answer when it comes to the question of why is really, I don't know. Like, we truly don't have access to what's cooking in the way we think we do. And that can be a bit terrifying, depending upon how you make sense out of it. But there's a lot of liberation to be found in that as well. In the same realm, another book that really did me in, so to speak, is Ian McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary. He does I think this is a beautiful book. It's an awesome book that really shows how the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere is kind of simultaneously creating very different constructions of life and who we are and stuff like that. So that also messes a little bit with that deep cultural assumption that there's this core self that's stable and autonomous and moves through time and which is us, right? Read that book and it might just begin to shake the foundation of that belief. It's also a great book to criticize the very materialistic Western worldview that most of us seem to be very fused with. So, great book. I really, really recommend it. Another book that has been very influential in my work is Michael Shermer's The Believing Brain. And what I really like about this one is if you ask someone, why do you vote that particular political party, or how did you know that that person was guilty or innocent of that particular charge, or why do you believe in God, or why are you an atheist? People might say, I don't know, but the more reflective types will offer answers, and they very often revolve around, well, I look at the evidence, I have my life experiences, and I look at the evidence, so I experience first, and I use my logic and my reasoning to land at my beliefs. Shermer's book does a great job in pointing to how the psychological science seems to be pointing in a very different direction. And that is that the human mind detects patterns, but also creates patterns and creates stories about them. And that the brain is kind of a belief engine. We actually start by believing. We seem to very quickly create a kind of impression of what we think has happened or what something means. And then, more like a good lawyer or press secretary than a scientist, even though it's often hard to tell them apart in actuality, we tend to create a story that supports what we already believe to be true, while believing strongly that we're doing the exact opposite, right? So if you ask jurors, judges, they'll often say that, oh, we reach our decisions by logic and evidence, but through these experiments with mock trials, for example, it's shown that they usually land on guilty or innocent really quick. The mind makes up a story of what it thinks happens, and then the lawyer comes in and creates a set of reasons and explanations to support what they already believe. I tend to believe, and ironically, now that I believe it, I can't not see it everywhere, right? But I tend to believe that the deep human tendency for confirmation bias might be our biggest psychological challenge as a species. So it makes sense to really delve into and look into that topic. Let's see what else that we have here. So fields like cognitive psychology, social psychology, neurolinguistic programming, hypnosis are often great at pointing people in the direction of, there's interpretation going on. We're kind of constructing our experience. But not only that, we seem to construct our experience through these stages of development. And when people get more complex in their meaning making, they tend to do so in a sequential way, meaning there seems to be these meaning making stages that we humans go through when we evolve and mature psychologically. Uh, you know, what seems to be self and what seems to be other shifts, what looks like reality and what looks like an idea shifts. So a great source for this is In Over Our Heads by Robert Keegan. By the way, if you're a psychotherapist or hypnotherapist or coach, if you start with the chapter, The Hidden Demands of Psychotherapy, that just rocked my world when I read it back in 2008. It just changed the way I approach life and change work forever. So I highly recommend checking out Robert Keegan's work. You can also check out Susan Cook-Reuter and Spiral Dynamics. I'm not that big of a fan of that, but even if the model isn't quite correct in a sense, I mean, no model is, it offers a different vantage point, a different angle. A couple of more sources here. Loving What Is by Byron Katie. This is the revised edition. Really love this one. One thing I really love about it is the work on projections. Learning to turn statements around and exploring the projector instead of only looking at what is being projected. So reading Byron Katie's books and doing the work and playing with that has also helped me in terms of mind-body distinctions. I have a critique video, by the way, about Byron Katie's The Work, what I think are strengths and weaknesses of that particular approach. If you're curious and you want to watch it on my YouTube channel, you can. Let's see, what else do we have here? Yes, I recommend looking into The Inside Out Revolution of Michael Neill. Sydney Banks's The Three Principles really rocked my world back in 2013. I really like George Pransky's book. Jack Pransky's books are good. I've read, I think, about 40 books, probably most of the books that have been written. And one thing I really like about Sydney Banks's teachings is that it really focuses on not the content of thinking or the process of thinking, but the fact of thinking. Thinking as a fundamental principle of experience. This is something I teach in the psychological illusion model that I teach as well, but I highly recommend looking into those sources. As someone who did at least 10 years of hypnosis regression work, the more I looked into memory, the more I became disturbed about what we were doing as a profession. I highly recommend this book called Memory Warp by Mark Pendergrast. It does a superb job in illuminating how the repressed memory epidemic of especially North America, but parts of Europe as well, uh, arised, and how people can end up believing that they have been subjected to horrible sexual abuse that in all likelihood never happened. How people ended up believing that they were high priestesses in underground satanic cults, physically impossible things, things that there are no evidence for, but that they completely believed in. So I highly recommend looking into that as well. Also, because this is arguably one of the biggest scandals in the whole psychology field, the whole repressed memory epidemics of the 80s and 90s. So Mark Pendergrass there is an awesome choice. Let's see, a couple of final suggestions here. Um, if you really look into how our experience is constructed, sooner or later you'll probably begin to look at the sense of a self, this notion of being the constructor or the organizer or the CEO or the thinker or the decider. And if you really do inquiry into that, you'll discover that is an illusion, right? So I highly recommend exploring non-duality, experientially. Um, what you'll, in terms of map territory distinctions, what you'll discover, of course, is that the world is not what you think it is, right? And that other people are never who you think they are. There's a cool t-shirt I saw once, which was, "I'm not responsible for your versions of me in your head." It points to something. But not only that, you're not even the ideas you have about who you are. That's also a thought constructed fiction. And the whole notion of this self that makes decisions and choices is a thought created illusion. If you want to look into this a little bit, I highly recommend a couple of sources. Rupert Spira being one. The Transparency of Things is a great book, really rocked my world when I first read it. There's another book here too, if I could only find it, that I don't seem to be able to find at the moment, but it's called, oh, here it is. I just looked in the wrong place. Happiness Beyond Thought by Gary Weber. So when you explore, let's say, Rupert Spira style, you might very likely expand the sense of self, not to be the type of finite mind, but to more being that the I am represents consciousness itself. If you do Gary Weber's work, you might end up with completely deconstructing the selfing process itself and discover that consciousness is often the last hiding place of the sense of a self, as uh, as you can discover. So I really recommend Weber as well. A final suggestion for you is Why Materialism is Baloney by Bernardo Kastrup. I've never been religious, and I've always been uneasy with materialism. I've really enjoyed reading Bernardo Kastrup because it has helped me to see just how utterly ridiculous the tenets of materialism are. He's very good at pointing that out. And I think it's very healthy to read him because the main cultural worldview, if you will, in the West is that of materialism. It saturates everything. And materialism, the deeper assumptions behind it are so ridiculous. Uh, So I highly recommend you checking out that. So those are my recommendations. I hope you're inspired to check some of them out. I want you to know that I have no benefits of recommending these books. I don't have any deals with any of the authors. None of these people are people I know personally. So that's a good thing to know. Also know that I see clients from all over the world online. So if you're curious to see whether you and I could be a good fit, I invite you to send me an email at provocativehypnosis.com. We'll schedule a conversation and see if it makes sense to work together as a team. If you're watching this in 2025, I have a How to See Through the Self-Illusion Masterclass coming up. See, if you want to have a real shift in seeing the illusory nature of the self, I recommend checking that out. You can go to provocativehypnosis.com in the seminar page to check it out. All right. As always, thanks for listening. If you found the video useful, please share it with someone, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and we'll talk soon.